Perfect. Okay, so here's just a little outline of what we're going to be discussing. We're going to start with some psychoeducation on what anxiety is. We're going to look at the thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and physical sensations that show up with anxiety. We'll also discuss how to discern between normal worry, which is something we're all wired to have, and problematic worry. And that sort of worry that's getting in the way of living our lives. We'll then focus a large portion of today discussing coping skills for children and teens, and then end with a very timely discussion on how children and teens may be experiencing worry during COVID. We have some really great resources to share at the end, and as mentioned, we'll spend some time doing a Q&A. So let's get started. So what is anxiety? Anxiety, also referred to as worry, stress, nervousness, fear, is a completely normal and healthy reaction to stressful events that move us in a way to respond in a way that'll keep us safe. It shows up in a number of different ways, namely through our thoughts, through our feelings, and in our behaviors. And it is extremely common, affecting upwards of 20% of children and adolescents over their lifespan. So this flow chart just can show you one example of how anxiety can actually be helpful in a potentially dangerous event. So you're at home and you smell smoke in the house, and your first thought might be, oh God, I'm in danger. And this thought may lead you to feel worried or anxious, which can get your body ready for action, getting out of the house and calling 911. So to help us differentiate, though, between normal and problematic worry, it's sometimes helpful to look at age-appropriate fears across childhood and adolescence. So this table here shows a number of age-appropriate fears. And that just means fears that most children typically experience at each stage of development. And interestingly, these fears typically coincide with a child's brain development. So for example, prior to a child understanding that their caregiver is still around, even when they're out of view, babies can become fearful if their parents are not in sight. Another example for older kids, as children develop into teens and their brains are wired to seek social inclusion or support, they may become more fearful of rejection or judgment from others. And another way we can try to understand when normal worry becomes problematic is referring to these 4 Ds. So one is disproportionate. This refers to a worry that may feel bigger than what we would typically expect given a child's age or given the situation. So for example, having to present in front of the class may cause most kids to feel a bit nervous. However, if it triggers panic-like symptoms or sort of extreme fear of being rejected or ostracized, we may consider the reaction a bit disproportionate to the situation. Duration means that the worry would last longer than we would expect. So for example, many kids will have butterflies that first week of school and sometimes even the first month. But if that same level of worry lasts well into the school year, we may consider it problematic. Disruption refers to how much that anxiety is getting in the way of their day-to-day functioning. So getting to school, enjoying time with their friends, or going to extracurriculars, or getting along with their parents. And finally, distress refers to a child's inability to experience joy because they're so preoccupied with their worry, and they're aware of how much that worry is affecting their day-to-day life. So as I mentioned, anxiety can be thought of as impacting us in different ways, from our feelings to our thinking, to our actions, and of course, our bodily sensations. And the signs that we're going to discuss are things that most parents and teachers will see occasionally, but if they're frequent and intense, then it's more likely an indication of worry. So let's start with feelings. So as I mentioned, the worry can often feel as though it is out of proportion to the situation. So this can sometimes appear like expecting the worst case scenario. So for example, if I fail this math quiz, I'm going to fail this course. If I fail this course, I'm not going to get into university, and then I won't get a job. These kiddos can make this leap to the worst case scenario pretty quickly. It can also look like overestimating the probability that something bad will happen. So for example, if their caregiver is late to picking them up from school, they may automatically assume that it's because they've been in a car accident. So children and teens with anxiety find it hard to recognize any other possibilities or the likelihood of those possibilities happening, like traffic or their parent picking up something at the grocery store. They really sort of overestimate the chances of that negative thing happening. Second, youth with anxiety might be hypersensitive to rejection or danger. And this could include rejection or exclusion by peers, particularly for kids who are worried about the perceptions of others. So for example, your child may see a gathering on social media and think, my friends are together and they didn't even invite me. Now, it doesn't ever feel good to sort of feel excluded. But seeing this on social media might trigger significant upset or feelings of just being so distraught and like they can't shake it. And then maybe thinking like they hate me, everyone hates me, I can't face them again, I'm not going to school. And finally, in some children and teens, anxiety can come with a lot of other emotions. So for younger children, it might look like a lot of anger, maybe sometimes in the form of a temper tantrum, particularly if they're having a difficult time coping in a situation that's hard for them, like unstructured recess time. In teenagers, you might see it come out as more as irritability or sadness. Anxiety is also really evident in our thinking patterns or the things that we sort of say to ourselves in our minds. So kids with anxiety are often thinking and talking a lot about worries. For some kids, it might seem like they worry about everything under the sun. So today it's their marks, then they hear something on the news, then they're worried that someone will be mad at them, and it can almost feel like a bit of a whack-a-mole. Well, for other kids, it's being really worried about something super specific. So like the health or the death of a loved one, leading some kids to feel sort of some of that separation anxiety, or this sort of obsession about what other kids are thinking about them, leading to some of that social anxiety. Students with anxiety can also have difficulty concentrating on lessons or schoolwork or even in their social relationships. So sometimes, kids with anxiety's difficulties with concentration is because their minds are so consumed with worry. So this could be a kid who is so concerned that what they ate at lunch maybe poisoned them that they can't focus on what the lesson is in real time. Or other kids may have this sort of sense of feeling so overwhelmed and so worried that their minds kind of go blank. I think about these kids who, are so conscientious, they study for their tests, they know the information, but they get to that sort of test taking situation and their minds go blank. It's like a deer in a headlight sort of situation. And finally, anxiety also has certain types of thinking patterns, and they're often negative thinking patterns. So this can include negative thoughts about the future. I'm going to fail this test. I'm never going to do well. I'm never going to amount to, what I want to, or negative thoughts about the self. I suck at reading. No one likes me. I'm so boring. Anxiety also really affects our behaviors or the actions that we do. One very common characteristic of anxiety is avoidance. We tend to avoid things that we are afraid of. So for example, teens who are fear of judgment may avoid social situations, or children who are afraid of separating from their parents may refuse to go to school or to do things that they enjoy. And it's worth noting, of course, that some shyness or worry about meeting unfamiliar kids is normal. And we certainly don't need everyone to be an extrovert, but it's more concerning if this withdrawing and avoiding is a change from how your child might typically present. So if your kid in grade 8 was the, valedictorian and head of student council, and now in grade 9, you're seeing this really, sort of withdrawal of social engagement, then we might sort of wonder if there's something like worry at play. Another behavior that's a bit insidious that's associated with anxiety is perfectionism. And it can be perfectionism about a variety of things like their appearance or schoolwork. And again, we want to think about how excessive it is and if it's getting in the way of their functioning. So for example, a lot of teens, of course, are spending a lot of time getting ready for school. But if it's accompanied by, multiple hours or a low self-esteem or not going to school because of a certain pimple or a hair being in the wrong place, then we want to sort of think of that as sort of being a bit disproportionate. Another common behavior is reassurance seeking or always wanting to check in or make sure everything is okay. And what you might find is that these kids can often seek assurance, but they don't often accept it. So it can look like a lot of what if questions. What if I forget my homework? What if my teacher doesn't like me? What if I mess up when I'm doing my presentation? And no answer you provide them is going to quite settle them in the same way that it might yourself or another child. Anxiety can also lead to problems with school and academic performance, and this can be for a variety of reasons. Some, like I had already mentioned before, finding it hard to focus in class because they're worried about a lot of other things, or because they're so perfectionistic that they don't want to hand something in unless the work is of a certain quality. Now, this can kind of sometimes start with a more occasional, I feel sick, when they have to go to school and present, but it can escalate really quickly to sort of a refusal to attend school. And that sort of gets kids in a bit of a cycle because, then they might worry about missing school, which sort of results in work piling up or feeling awkward going back after being away for so long, and therefore they miss more school. And finally, here you may see changes in eating and sleeping patterns, and that could be either, a big increase in both of these or a decrease in both of these. As you can probably imagine, having worried thoughts can make it hard to sort of settle yourself at night and to, if you wake up with a worried thought, to kind of stay asleep for the rest of the night. And as we'll talk about in the next slide as well, the way our bodies feel physically, so feel anxiety physically, can sometimes affect things like our appetite, like if our stomach is sort of in knots, for example. So finally, anxiety could show up through physical symptoms or sensations. So that's things like headaches or dizziness or stomach aches or nausea, changes in breathing. And at home, you might hear, my stomach is upset, I'm sick and I can't go to school. At school, these might be the students who are reporting they don't feel well and asking if they can go to the office and call home. Now, what's really important to note with this is that while children and teens are most often not actually sick, the physical or physiological feelings are very much real. So that is, it can be really hard for a child to discern between feeling this way due to an illness or due to worry, because it really feels the same way in their bodies. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. So now we're going to shift to talking about strategies to help your children and teens cope when they're feeling worried. And our first recommendation is to begin with listening and acceptance. So this means providing kids with a safe space to be able to talk and be heard without necessarily kind of jumping to reassurance or pushing to problem solving. So we really want to invite parents and caregivers to just start by listening to the child and teen's concerns and accepting that they're very real concerns for them. We also want to acknowledge that sometimes this can feel hard to do. So most parents and caregivers, they want their child to be happy, they want their child to be content and calm. And if our child comes to us with a worry or a concern, oftentimes our immediate urge or response might be to reassure them or to minimize the issue or to provide a kind of simple solution that can do the trick. And while these intentions are really good, in doing so, we might accidentally misread the situation or dismiss our children's feelings, kind of leaving them feeling like we just don't really get what they're going through. Offering quick solutions can also take away our children's ability to kind of develop their own problem-solving skills. So step one is just to start by listening and accepting their point of view. Here's an example of what that might sound like. So in this situation, the teen comes to their caregiver and says, "Oh, I didn't get invited to Justin's party. It's because no one really likes me and no one likes hanging around with me." And her caregiver might feel pretty upset at seeing their daughter so sad, and she likely wants to, reassure her that she has plenty of friends and there's lots of people who like her. But instead she replies, "It hurt that you didn't get invited to the party because you were so excited about going. I get it. I'd feel just pretty disappointed too." And what this might do is it might help put her teen's experience into words by labeling the emotion and kind of validating the reasons behind the emotion. And this might leave the teen feeling heard, understood, and though her feelings are sort of valid and okay. Now we want to take a moment to talk about instances where your child or teen doesn't necessarily want to talk about their worries, but your spidey sense is that something's going wrong. So for one thing, it's important, and this can be hard to do, but to try not to personalize their silence. We know there's a number of reasons that children or teens might not want to speak about their worries. They might not have the words, they might not have the insight to understand exactly what they're feeling, or they might be feeling sort of too emotional to be able to talk about it at that particular moment. And if it's just sort of a one-off concern or a passing situation, it might just be okay to kind of let it pass and let it go. But if you're finding that it feels pretty persistent, it's happening a lot and it's there a fair bit of the time, you might want to talk to other adults in their lives. So maybe a teacher or a coach who knows them really well, to see if they've noticed anything and to understand if there might be any particular stressors that your child or teen is experiencing. Some other things that it might be worth trying are being physically present. So what this means is using nonverbal cues to communicate that you're open and available to talk about whatever's concerning them. So for younger children, this might kind of be getting down to their level and being sort of physically beside them. For teens, it might be sitting beside them, not necessarily with direct eye contact, or if they're in their rooms, just sort of checking in on them every once in a while. You might also try to guess what's worrying your child and teen. So this can be particularly helpful for children and teens who might not know what that icky feeling is, who might not have the language to understand kind of exactly what they're feeling, just to sort of make guesses. You might be wrong, and that's okay, but it might help them build a little awareness and some more language to talk about their feelings. You can also let your child or teen know that you respect their need for space and time, but that you're open and available to talk if they want to talk in the future, that you're still there and ready for them when they're ready. And finally, doing something fun together can be a healthy distraction that can kind of shift feelings a little bit in the moment sometimes. So it may be the case that, if you do something that kind of takes your mind off it, it can get you sort of unstuck or give you a new kind of perspective on the situation. And they might be a little bit better able to talk about it down the road. It might also be helpful to notice situations. This is kind of noticing them over time, to notice situations that make it easier for your child or teen to talk. So example, some caregivers might have noticed that there's particular situations, maybe it's when you're going for a walk or taking a car ride, doing the dishes. There's situations where your kiddo is more likely to talk. So for teens, it might be that not having to look at their caregiver in the eye might make them feel a little bit more at ease and more inclined to speak a little bit more. For younger children, maybe it's before bed is a time when they're kind of feeling safe and comfortable and like they have your undivided attention. So sort of you can pay attention over time to situations that make it less likely for your teen or child to talk or more likely for your teen or child to talk. You can also try being creative with how you talk about feelings and coming up with creative ways. So for example, some things might be, reading books that talk about feelings. The Feelings book or The Color Monster are two options, or watching movies. Inside Out is a really great one to kind of have an interesting take on feelings and build feelings language. Finally, remembering one of the key ways that caregivers can teach kids to talk about their feelings is through modeling, so kind of showing what it is that you do. So talking about your own feelings can be a really helpful guide for children to be able to talk more about their own feelings. So for example, you might say something like, oh man, I'm feeling really worried about my presentation tomorrow because there's going to be a lot of people there and it's really important for me. So there you're sort of modeling using feelings language and also explaining kind of what's underlying your feeling at that moment. Okay, so now we're going to spend a little bit of time focusing on strategies that you might use during a conversation about worry when your child or teen is ready to talk. So first, we want to focus on acknowledging their perspective and why that's important. So we want kids and teens to sort of learn to manage strong feelings like anxiety in a healthy way. And to do this, it helps for them to kind of understand what they're feeling and where the feeling is coming from. So pretty often children and teens and adults too sometimes struggle to know sort of what they're feeling. They might just feel kind of off or yucky and not really be sure why. And sometimes they might feel like their bodies or their actions are out of control. So adults can help by doing things like listening to your child's experience, labeling their emotions using feelings words, helping them understand what might be causing their emotions, and acknowledging their feelings by saying that you get what they're going through and it makes sense that they feel the way they do. Again, the big idea here is that by helping them understand their emotions, you're kind of laying the groundwork for them to be able to respond in a helpful way. We want to take a moment to sort of acknowledge that sometimes it can be hard to see your kid's perspective. Their emotions might seem really kind of absurd or out of proportion to the situation. So for example, if you have a child who's just a really excellent basketball player, but is constantly worried about losing the game for her team, you might have the urge to say, just calm down, you're worried for nothing, you're overreacting. But it's important to remember that in that moment, that is her emotion. She really is worried, and it's really real for her. And if we dismiss it outright, we kind of miss an opportunity to help her learn to, identify and understand that feeling and perhaps gain a new perspective or cope in that situation. So once you've sort of acknowledged the situation and the child feels heard and understood, then it might be time to invite the child to see the situation in another way. And to sort of unpack this a little bit, we're going to use this idea of a balance between kind of acknowledging where your child's coming from, emotion mind, and then gently introducing another way to think about the situation, or rational mind. And to do this, I'm going to use an adult example. So I want you to imagine that you yourselves are in a situation and you have a deadline coming up. And this can be anything. It can be something at work. It could be paperwork you have to do at home, dealing with the mountains of laundry and dishes that just sort of seem to grow all the time. And I want you to imagine you're talking to a friend about it. So now if there's a friend who's sort of too strong on emotion mind, they might say something like, oh my gosh, you're never going to make it. There's so little time. I totally get why you're worried. Why did you commit to all that? You're never going to get it done. So when you're really strong on emotion mind, it can leave you feeling like, yeah, this person gets what I'm going through, but I'm feeling more worried than I did before I started talking to them. So now imagine you're speaking to another friend who's a little too much rational mind or a little too much introducing the other perspective. They might say something like, what? I don't get why you're so worried. That's not really a problem. You're going to be fine. You're always stressed about things, and then it ends up working out. You should see what I have to do this weekend. So too much rational mind can often leave you feeling sort of unheard or dismissed, and you might not be inclined to talk to that person about your feelings again in the future. So now let's imagine a situation where somebody has a little bit of both, a little bit of emotion mind and a little bit of rational mind. They might say something like, oh, I get it. Deadlines are stressful, especially when you have so much other stuff going on. I also know, though, that you have super organized to-do lists and are really good at accomplishing miracles under pressure. So in this situation, you might feel like the person kind of gets your side of things, but also they maybe made you feel a little bit better about the situation. So what does this look like for kids? Let's imagine a situation where it's the end of the school day and your child or teen said hi to their best friend, but the best friend didn't respond and kind of just ran down the hall out of the school. And now your child has come home, and again, like, they're saying things like, she hates me, she doesn't like me anymore, I don't have any friends, no one likes me. So if you're too strong an emotion mind, it might sound something like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. I'm so sorry, that's terrible of her. What do you think you did recently that made her so upset with you? Of course you don't want to go back to school tomorrow. Nobody would. Too much rational mind, on the other hand, might be something like, I wouldn't worry about it. Get over it. There's lots of kids in your class who are friends that you can be friends with. And again, if we're trying to get this balance of sort of acknowledging their perspective and also inviting them to think about yet another situation in another way, you might say something like, I can see why you would feel worried that your friend is mad at you. That it would be a hard situation. I wonder if there's any other reasons she might not have had time to talk yesterday. I know that sometimes she has to rush to pick up her brother or go to soccer practice. I wonder if she was just rushing and running late. So after you've acknowledged your child's perspective, perhaps invited them to think about the situation in a different way, in some situations, it might be also helpful to join them in kind of problem solving or thinking through the situation. And this is something that we sort of naturally do as adults in kind of a second nature sort of way. But for kids, it can be helpful to help them develop this skill by being really explicit about the steps of problem solving. So if we think about walking through the steps, you would do things like identifying the problem. So what's the problem or situation? Brainstorming all the ways that you can solve that problem with them. And then choosing the situation or the solution that seems like it would make the most sense. And then kind of after your child's implemented that solution, sort of revisiting and thinking like, how did it go? And one of the kind of key ideas here is that this process is meant to sort of be collaborative rather than you sort of telling them what to do. So because we want them to learn that skill. So for example, in brainstorming ideas, you might have a whole bunch of ideas, they might have a whole bunch of ideas. They won't necessarily all be great ideas, but kind of the brainstorming phase, you bring in all the ideas that you can. And then you sort of go through and veto and identify the pros and cons of different options. But you want it to be a sort of together process.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the importance of facing feared situations. So as Ashley had pointed out in the beginning of the presentation, anxiety can lead us to avoid situations that make us feel anxious. So an example might be if you're feeling anxious about going to a party, you might just decide not to go to the party. Or for a child, if they're feeling anxious about a test, they could skip class and just avoid the test. So the problem with avoidance is that it helps us in the short term, but long term, it has consequences that can lead to even worse anxiety. So, for example, if you chronically skip parties, it might make attending them seem even more scary. And if you skip a test, you either have to make it up or, this might have ramifications for your grades, and then the anxiety becomes even worse. But really, the worst consequence of avoidance is that you've missed out on an opportunity to teach yourself that you can actually handle the situation. And so facing situations makes us feel less worried over time because it teaches us that we can handle it. So to give a personal example, I'm actually quite nervous about giving presentations, and part of why I signed up to help out with this conference was so that I could face that fear. And the hope is that it will start to get a little bit easier the more presentations that I give. So lots of the time, kids and teens are worried about things that they're actually capable of handling. And we want to encourage them to face their fears, but it's also important to keep in mind about how far to push things. So when you're sort of thinking about facing a fear, it's good to start in small ways. So for me, with this, giving a presentation over Zoom is a little bit less scary than giving a presentation to hundreds of people in person. I have my notes readily available. You guys hopefully don't know that or can't tell. So there's certain things that make it a little bit less scary. So to give a more child example, let's say you have a child who's gets nervous in social situations. It might be helpful to start with them going to a birthday party with 4 or 5 familiar kids, as opposed to, sending them away to a 2-week summer camp um, where they won't have any breaks and don't have any way to get away from that situation. So it's good to start with small steps and work on small goals. And then also to praise your child when they've conquered a feared situation. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some self-care skills for coping with anxiety. And self-care skills can help us in 2 ways. So first, they can help us calm down when we're feeling anxious in the moment. And the second is that when these are incorporated as part of our lifestyle, they can help us manage general levels of worry and promote good mental health. So on the left is a reminder to have fun, and it's important to make time for hobbies and games. And this can be particularly helpful when your child has a worry that isn't an immediately solvable problem. So, for example, if your child has to get a needle and they're feeling anxious, you can encourage them to do something fun to take their mind off the situation. And then the 3 strategies on the right, I kind of like to call these the trifecta of lifestyle interventions. Um, Mindfulness, exercise, and sleep all have really solid research evidence behind them for ability to help us manage anxiety and mental health in general. And getting better at any one of those 3 things makes it easier to do the other 2. So exercise and movement are super important. Exercise lowers stress hormones in our bodies. It reduces levels of general anxiety, and it can be used as a non-pharmacological method to reduce overall anxiety. And exercise can also have immediate benefits when it comes to sleep difficulties and academics. Um, the research isn't too picky about what the exercise is, but the important thing is to move your body, and your child is more likely to stick to it if they find an activity that they enjoy. And anxious thoughts can make it difficult to get a good night's sleep. So anxiety is linked both to trouble falling asleep and to restless sleep. And when we're not well rested, it becomes even more difficult to manage anxiety, and this can become a vicious cycle. So these are some tips for getting a good night's rest that we call sleep hygiene. So that includes trying to go to bed and wake up at the same time, limiting screen time before bed, because research shows that the blue light from our devices can affect our ability to fall asleep and affect the sleep-wake cycle. So this is a big one now, and especially during COVID, we have so many screens in our lives. And more kids have smartphones and they might be taking them into the bed, but it's really not ideal to have those in the bed, in bed in particular. So it's important to use bed only for sleep, so it sets the body up that this is where I have rest. Practicing deep breathing before bed can help your body relax. Making sure that you're sleeping in a dark room. Getting natural light during the day helps with our circadian rhythm to help us be in a good routine to get sleep. And having predictable sleep routines can help us unwind. So, with kids, it might be something like reading them a story. With teens, it might be, having a shower and then reading a book. But it's good to sort of have those predictable patterns that help get your body in that mindset that it's time for sleep. So you've probably heard about mindfulness. It's become an increasingly popular way to manage stress and anxiety. And it's popular because it works. You may have heard a few different definitions. So we define it as being aware of what's happening right now in the present moment. And mindfulness can help us pay attention to both things that are happening around us and to sensations within our bodies. Mindfulness teaches us where emotions show up in the body. So, for example, for myself, I know I'm feeling anxious. My heart starts beating faster. Sometimes I get kind of like a prickly sensation in my armpits, probably starting to sweat. Or sometimes like a feeling in the pit of my stomach. And, a lot of people feel stress as sort of tension across the back of the shoulders. And learning to pay attention to our body's signals can help us notice emotions as they escalate. And this can help us learn when we need to pause and help us be more aware of how to respond to something in a slow way rather than reacting automatically. So mindfulness can give us clues as to when we need to take a deep breath and slow down. The best way to share mindfulness with kids and teens is to experience it with them. So exploring different strategies and tools can keep things short and fun and help them figure out ways to be motivated to explore this. So there's a few different ways to teach mindfulness to children and teens. There's a lot of popular apps that exist now, like Calm, Headspace, Mindshift, Stop, Breathe, and Think Kids. A lot of these are free or have a free version or free trials. And they have a lot of guided meditations that help you focus your attention. And then there's also a lot of great books about mindfulness that you can get at the library. So Sitting Still Like a Frog and The Mindful Teen. You can also use art and creativity as a way to spark interest in mindfulness. So a mindful jar is one example. And basically what this involves is getting a clear jar. It can be something like a mason jar or something plastic if you're worried about breaking. You fill it with water, dish soap, glitter. And the way this works is you explain to kids that the way their mind works when they're experiencing difficult emotions is like when you shake the jar and the contents are swirling everywhere. And when they calm down, that's like watching the glitter settle to the bottom of the jar. Coloring pages are another great way to increase attention to the present moment. There's, tons of books available and free coloring pages online. And there's also a wide variety of videos on YouTube that caregivers can engage in with their children and teens, lots of free resources. So Sesame Street and Cosmic Kids are more for younger children. And the Go Noodle movement videos. Okay. And relaxation is an important skill that we need to teach explicitly and make a priority. And this is something that we can really model to our kids by taking even time for ourselves and say, nope, I need 5 minutes, please, and model to our children what that looks like. Okay. And then finally, it's really important to monitor our own feelings and actions. So when we see a child or a teen upset, it can evoke those same emotions in ourselves. So, I think this is true for many of our families. When you have a family member who's feeling anxious, sometimes you might start to take on some of that emotion yourself. Um, and it's not nice seeing our loved ones feeling anxious. So sometimes, we may end up jumping in and trying to fix the problem as quickly as possible, which can sometimes lead to us rescuing our children and engaging in, again, maybe helping them with more of those avoidance behaviors that make them feel better in the short term, but don't help overall. So an example like, letting our child miss school whenever they have a test. So, it's important to catch yourself when you're feeling overwhelmed or feeling like there's a contagious emotion happening in the moment, and to slow down and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And so I think the great thing about the self-care strategies that were presented previously with the sleep and mindfulness and exercise is that, our children can use them, but these are things that we can use with ourselves as well.
Thanks, Veronica. So in the last part of the presentation, we're going to cover COVID and the return to learning. So every family has selected the best option for them for learning during this time. So whether it's virtual, a combination of virtual and then at home for the high school students, or in-school learning, whichever mode that you chose for your child, there are certainly advantages and disadvantages for each. Everyone has had to make adjustments, and it's not ideal. Everyone is trying to do their best. There are rewards and benefits for your choice, and also the risks and challenges. Some students may struggle with adjusting to their remote learning or continued remote learning, and others to come back to school. Some students are, a bit upset that they're in a class cohort that's bigger or smaller, or there's changes in the classrooms and they can't see their friends as much as they would like. And others, for example, teens may be struggling to not be able to socialize so much outside of classes, or the grade 9 starting and not having significant social experience in that first year. So we go back to the idea of variability. You might see changes in how your children and teens are responding over time. You could see shifts between how they're feeling confused about what's happening, or maybe they're still enjoying the novelty of having online learning, or maybe that is becoming more wearisome for them over time. And this can change moment to moment or week to week, as well as the household mood and morale may be kind of all over the place. When or if there is a positive test in the classroom or school, things can get very stressful for families, certainly for students. This can bring up anxiety and worry, where people will have to be in a period of uncertainty for a while, awaiting tests, monitoring symptoms before they get the all clear to return to class. And we know that this is stressful for them and can bring out intense worries. This is a terrific slide. I love this slide. This was shown in a PD presentation to all staff at the school board in those days in September. And it's just really, it's essential to remember that we are in a pandemic and that normal life is not the same as it was many months ago. Every community, school, family, and person will not only have to make adjustments in their life, but also could be experiencing some degree of loss, some of which could be catastrophic and tragic. We also know that there are racialized and marginalized groups that have faced additional barriers over the past months and loss. And this was certainly brought to our attention over the past summer. We know that one's experience is not the same as somebody else's. So your experience is not the same as your neighbor's, but everyone has their own story. Because a sense of control is so important to our health and well-being, our minds go to great lengths to gain control in the face of uncertainty. And this can be challenging as there are often a lot of things that are beyond our control, especially now. Through highlighting activities that are within our control, as well as those that are beyond our control, we can begin to shift our attention and efforts to things that we do have a say over, like following the guidelines of public health, like keeping good hand hygiene and physical distancing, which can bring us a further sense of calm. So one of the biggest tenets of anxiety is living with uncertainty. And there is no other time in my lifetime that we can have this as really demonstrates this. During COVID, there is a lot of uncertainty, and certainly there's so much we still don't know. And so this is the main task in our life right now, and it is challenging. People often look for certainty, they look for answers, and they strive for things to be predictable. And as parents and caregivers, we often try to do this for our children. Parents want to know what's going to happen next. They want to help prepare their children. Children want answers too that give them a sense of control. And many answers are hard to come by right now. So we are managing the uncertainty the best that we can. And we focus on what we can control. It's okay that there are questions that you may not be able to answer. Will there be a vaccine? Will I go to parties again? Given how much uncertainty there is, and sometimes you will have to say, I don't know. And it is living with a bit of that uncertainty with your child that helps build resiliency and coping for anxiety over time. It's also helpful to validate your child's experiences, just as Vicki and Ashley and Veronica had talked about, that they may be feeling confused and hopeless and discombobulated and overwhelmed. And so you do want to say, like, I get that you miss your friends. And it is really frustrating to not to know exactly when you'll be able to hang out with them again, or you miss those times where you could just be with them in close physical proximity. So we want to recognize and acknowledge truths about the situation, even though it can be difficult. There are things that we don't know, and there's times in the future that we can't predict what it's going to be like. We can only manage what we know now. So what can we do as parents? You will hear this in different presentations, but it really is, first thing is we have to be gentle with ourselves. Feeling strong emotions right now is a normal reaction to an abnormal event. It's okay to feel worried, frustrated, disappointed, bored at times. Many people are. However, too much worry can impact our well-being. So we want to be using strategies to recognize and respond when worries are getting really big. So bring back to one of the original slides around the 4 indicators of that. Be mindful of social comparison. Social media might have examples of caregivers who are, making perfect cookies and terrific things and crafts and are able to kind of do those things. And you might have an inner critic that is sort of thinking, oh, I should do that, or I should have the time, or now I have the time and I should be doing it. Just again, remember, we're all doing the best that we can. Another thing that is helpful is listening and discussing worries that children and teens have. Let them ask about what they want to know and talk about their worries and feelings. It's important to provide honest and, of course, age-appropriate information about the virus. Particularly for children who are worriers, it may be necessary to address any misunderstandings of the worst-case scenario that they might have about the virus. Sometimes children have difficulty understanding the bigger picture, so hearing about a death on the news, it may make them worry about themselves and if they're in immediate danger. So you want to address any worries that they have about your family situation in an age-appropriate way. Also, it's important to remember that children do need boundaries to keep themselves safe and to help modulate some of their anxieties. So while you might be experiencing your worries and you might need conversations about employment, about finances, about behavior with your children, it's important that they not hear all of that information because it might inadvertently increase their own anxiety. So it's safe to say that COVID has dominated most news and media outlets. While it's helpful to be informed, it can be easy to become consumed with COVID news, which can increase our levels of anxiety about our current situation. We don't want to stop children from reading and watching the news, but we do want to set some helpful limits for those. First, there's the limit of terms of time. How much time and exposure do children have? The second is the source. Where are they getting this information? Is it from social media? Often there are some news stations that will give you up-to-date information that may not be helpful for your child. And thirdly, you can model finding good health information online for your child. So for example, if your child has some questions, you might want to show them where and how to find this from credible sources. So for example, giving them the website for Toronto Public Health or sitting with them as you go through the World Health Organization and help them make sense of this information. This is a good life skill to have in general, even beyond COVID. You can also talk to children about how some stories about COVID on the internet and social media could be based on rumors or inaccurate information. This will help build healthy critical thinking skills around media and media sources in general. And finally, of course, there's the pros and cons. How much time do you want to have all of your dinner conversations or your free time around the COVID? Be mindful of the impact of our own online presence on others. As you may notice, juggling work and school and family and friends, taking care of yourself may be harder and harder to do. What we know about worry is that doing activities to take care of ourselves can be helpful in managing difficult times, of course. And this is best practice. We know that to manage anxiety, you have to have good self-care. You have to have exercise. You need to be able to take care of yourself. Many self-care practices will be similar to what you already know, things that Veronica has covered, certainly around having movement, connecting with friends and loved ones, having physical outlets to go out with, even though that can be difficult as the weather moves ahead. But it's important to plan ahead and to kind of think about how you're going to change as the seasons move on. Though you may like to connect with friends and cousins over video chat, you might find that that's the only thing that they talk about. So broadening and bringing in new ideas to give other topics some floor space is also good self-care. So recognizing the positive is another strategy. Our brains have a way of focusing on the negative or the worrisome information. However, thinking about the positives or the silver lining of things that we are thankful for allows our brains to practice thinking about positive things. This can be hard to do in difficult or distressing times, like in the moment it could be difficult, but it's worth mentioning that this practice doesn't take away from our difficulties, but instead allows some attention to the positive aspects of our life that may get buried beneath the worries. So it ties very neatly into gratitude. Starting a gratitude practice can be another way to train our brain to focus on the positives. Gratitude can be a thought, or stopping to notice something and appreciate and be thankful for the good things that we have in our life. When you write down, for example, a list of, 2 or 3 things that you're grateful for or that happened that day, you're really asking your brain to scan the last 24 hours to find the positives. And over time, this practice can train your brain to be more skilled at noticing and focusing on the positive things that we need. So now we're looking at just the references that we have for you today. And they're really terrific resources. Anxiety is very, very treatable. There's lots of things that parents can do, caregivers can do on their own. So there's the Rappy book, there is the Catherine Manassas book, and as well as the Hubner book. So those are the ones that we've put on the screen that you can see. Of course, talking to your school support team, so represented by social work, OT, psychology, speech and language, child and youth care workers. So there's all of the support team that's available for support. Of course, your family doctor and pediatrician, and the What's Up walk-in clinics that are located around the city. And Kids Help Phone is phenomenal, has been phenomenal during this time. And for adults that are experiencing their own anxiety, the Distress Centers of Greater Toronto is the last resource that we put there. So what we're going to do now is have the question and answer period. So those of you that have had questions throughout have been maybe putting them in the chat. If you haven't had a chance to do that now, you can do that, and we'll field your questions.
And I will start by saying, because there are a lot of questions around whether the slides will be available. So they will be. We will be making these available afterwards. So I know some people have said, what were those mindfulness resources? You know, those will all be made available through the conference afterwards. So not to fret about that. I will ask one question that we got that was sort of discussing when ADHD and anxiety can co-occur, which we know can happen frequently. And sometimes the anxiety kind of gets masked because some of the ADHD behaviors might be more front and center. And so I guess this parent is sort of wondering, how do we help to communicate this sort of comorbidity to teachers, right? Because a lot of the times this parent's saying like the teachers are really noticing the ADHD, but they might not be so aware that the anxiety is sort of what might be driving some of what looks like inattention or distractibility. And so therefore some of the sort of interventions that they might be using might be sort of like missing the mark. So if any of you have sort of a response to that, how do we sort of like communicate that these things can co-occur and then support teachers to support child? I don't know if that was clear.
Well, I'll pop in with one idea and then you guys can sort of jump in if you want. I find it can be helpful if you can think of an example for your child to sort of almost invite people to kind of walk a mile in my shoes. So if I think of something that might happen for a kiddo with ADHD and anxiety, you know, maybe they, you know, had worked really hard on their science project and they had it all done, but then they were rushing in the morning because they were running late and they left their science project at home. And now throughout the morning, they're thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know my science project, what am I going to do in class? And they might have trouble focusing throughout the morning, but it's because, so you've kind of got this like mashup of the difficulties associated with one and the difficulties associated with the other. But I find if you're able to sort of, you know, give an example of what a typical situation's like and just kind of help teachers and other adults that are involved with a child sort of understand how those things can come together and what it's like for that student, that can build, sometimes if you've got kind of a concrete example, that can sometimes build an understanding of this might be what you see, you might be seeing, they're just not focused, they're just not listening. I've had to remind them 1,000 times. Whereas in reality, there's a lot more sort of thinking and feeling behind there that, as you say, isn't necessarily visible on the surface. I don't know if others have anything they want to pop in their 2 cents.
Yeah, no, that's anything else from you, Michelle or Veronica?
I guess just as a thought, you know, some of those more like lifestyle interventions that work with anxiety are also highly effective with ADHD, especially exercise. There's, you know, a ton of research on the effects of exercise with ADHD. So that might be something to advocate for with the teachers, ensuring that there's, you know, sufficient opportunities for movement breaks in the class, which can be a little bit trickier with COVID, as now, you know, we can't quite move around as much, but, you know, even just having movement breaks at the desk, it's something that can help with both, really.
Okay, I'm just going to get to some other questions. I'm just mindful of our time. So how to have a conversation with someone who always dismisses anxiety or stress. So this person's saying like, I wish we could it could be this switch that I just flick off or flick on. But obviously we know that that's not how it works. So I wonder, how to have like an opening of this kind of conversation with people. I don't know if you guys have any recommendations on that.
Is that between maybe two caregivers? Is that right? Is that what the question is? Or is it around?
Yeah, I guess in general, like whether it be with teachers, or whether it be with with caregivers, or whether sometimes it even is with students to students, right? Like kind of having this understanding that it isn't this thing that we can just like turn on and off, but like something a little bit more pervasive.
Yeah. And I think that it's can be about sort of understanding, tell me what it's like for you. So let's talk about it. What's it like for you? You can also ask them to describe in the moment what it feels like when they're feeling very, very anxious, and then when they're feeling calm, right? To kind of point out the differences. And just like anyone, people's moods will fluctuate. Anxiety ebbs and flows through the day. So I find that open-ended questions and sort of describing what it's like, because that's really personal. That's your own experience.
Mm-hmm. I think it can be hard now too, because a lot of the times you will really hear a lot of people, maybe sometimes flippantly saying like, oh, I'm so anxious about this. I'm so anxious about this. And I think sometimes people with anxiety can feel like it's real, right? It's just like, it's not something that's just so fleeting, right? That sort of comes and goes as quickly as it kind of can be for people who, like we said in the beginning, we all are wired to have anxiety, but the level that it sort of affects us can be really different. And so I can recognize that, from this person's perspective, it can feel a little different than, than others who might experience sort of the normal level of worry.
I think too, sometimes it can feel inconsistent even within a person, right? So I can think of people I know who have anxiety, who are very, very nervous about one specific thing. So maybe it's their health and well-being, or particular situations around school for adolescents. But then also they are the lead of the theater production, or they are very able to do presentations in front of the class. So there's situations in which they look really confident and non-anxious, and yet some situations in which they really do feel a lot of worry about certain things. And so to kind of bear in mind that, it also doesn't have to be consistent through a person that they're either anxious or not anxious. We function in different ways in different parts of our lives, and we feel confident and worried in different parts of our lives.
Yeah. One parent's wondering about some of the more physical sort of manifestations of anxiety. So either like hair pulling or nail biting. One is asking, can anxiety present in these ways? And then any sort of like supports where sort of we would direct them if these are some of the ways that their child is manifesting anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, certainly hair pulling, nail biting, and hair, any kind of hair, eyelashes, it could be anything. Sometimes stuttering starts, or there can be some difficulty holding their bowels or their urine over periods of time as well. So there really is, anxiety is very closely linked to our physical selves. For those kinds of things, I might start with their general practitioner. So your family doctor, who can direct you into the most appropriate community resource. That's probably where I would start. Certainly in any of the books that we have listed, there's different sections that will talk about the subtypes of anxiety that we didn't go over here. So it says compulsive, trichotillomania, like social anxiety specifically. There's lots of different kinds underneath there that can give you other more specific information, but I would start with your main healthcare practitioner.
Excellent. Okay, I've gotten a message from our Parents Partners person saying we need to log off so they can start the next presentation. So I apologize if we didn't get to some of the detailed questions. We will be offering our slides, so hopefully that'll be made available to you so that you can kind of go through this at your own pace as well. We thank you everyone so much for coming, and thank you to the presenters. I believe the slides will be offered at the end of the whole presentation. So I think at the end of, the end of the conference. So just check in with the site there. Again, thank you everyone for coming, and have a good rest of the conference.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.